Thunder cracked so violently over Ashland, Oregon, that the old Whitmore house seemed to flinch with every strike. Rain battered the windows, wind shrieked down the chimney, and the whole world outside felt like it was coming apart, shaking dust loose from rafters and memory alike. Inside, in a dim upstairs room, Lena Whitmore sat alone on her bed, knees pulled tight to her chest, eyes fixed on a faded photo clutched so hard her knuckles had turned white. In the photo, her parents smiled, arms around her, all sunlight and laughter from a life that now felt like a cruel story someone else had told. For Lena, there were no words left. Not since the fire. Not since that awful night when flames had swallowed her world and left her stranded in silence. Every sound seemed sharper now, as if the universe was compensating for the voice she'd lost. The heavy tick of the clock, the shudder of the old house with every gust, the shuffling steps of her guardian Eli Ramsey somewhere below, always careful, always sad. Outside, branches snapped against the glass, sharp, wild, chaotic. Inside, Lena barely moved. She tried to steady her breathing, feeling the ache in her chest, the hollow inside her that words used to fill. It was easier to go numb than to remember. Then, through the storm, another sound, a frantic, desperate barking, cut through the noise. Not the angry yelp of a neighbor's dog, but a panicked, raw howl, a voice fighting the storm and the dark together. Lena blinked, startled. The photo slipped from her grip, falling to the floor, face down on the old rug. She hesitated, frozen by instinct and memory. But the barking didn't stop. It grew louder, more urgent, clawing past the wind and thunder, as if calling her by name. Lena stood, her bare feet whispering across cold floorboards. She crept to the window and peered out, rain streaking down the glass. On the porch, barely visible in the storm's fury, was a German shepherd, big but battered, fur soaked through, sides heaving, eyes wide and wild. For one heartbeat, girl and dog stared at each other through the storm. Then the dog barked again, stumbling against the door, and something inside Lena snapped loose. She ran. She pounded down the stairs past Eli's study, where lamplight spilled under the door, out into the hallway, where she fumbled for the latch with trembling fingers. The wind nearly tore the door from her hand as she pulled it open, rain blasting her face, stinging cold and alive. The shepherd cowered but didn't run, flinching from the thunder but looking at her, as if he recognized the loneliness behind her eyes. Lena knelt, heedless of the rain soaking her nightgown, and reached out a hand. The dog trembled, then inched closer. His fur was matted with mud. There was blood on one ear, and a long, raw scrape down his side. She saw fear in his eyes, but also a plea, "Don't leave me out here." She pressed her hand to his shoulder. He shivered, but didn't pull away. Lightning lit up the sky behind them, stark and sudden. Behind her, Eli's voice called, wary and strained. "Lena, what on earth?" He stopped short in the hallway, taking in the scene. The storm, the shivering dog, the girl he'd watched drift further from the world each day. Lena stood, soaked, meeting Eli's shocked gaze for just a moment before turning to the dog. She touched his muzzle, gentle, her lips parted. She hadn't spoken in months, not since the world had burned. But as the wind howled, she found the smallest sliver of her voice, a whisper shaped by memory and need. "Scout," she said. The shepherd's ears perked up, and Eli's mouth fell open. For a long, shuddering moment, the only sound was the storm, the dog's labored breath, and Lena's heartbeat thundering in her chest. She pulled Scout inside, shutting out the storm. Rain puddled on the entryway tile, thunder shaking the house as Lena crouched to inspect his wounds, hands gentle but certain. Scout pressed his head against her knee, eyes closing in exhausted relief. Eli hovered, unsure. This was the first word he'd heard from Lena since the fire, and it rattled something loose inside him too. He cleared his throat, trying to sound stern but only managing worry. "He'll ruin the floors, kid." But Lena didn't look up. She tore a towel from the hallway closet and began to dry Scout, her movements clumsy but determined. In that flickering lamplight, a silent agreement formed between girl and dog. Two survivors, battered by the world, bound together by need. Lena whispered Scout again, and the dog's tail thumped weakly. All around them the house moaned with wind and water, but inside, for the first time in months, Lena felt something spark. Pain, hope, terror, something alive, something shared. Scout leaned in, licking her hand, and Lena let out a shaky breath, neither a sob nor a laugh, but the start of something new. Upstairs, a photo of happier days lay forgotten on the floor, but downstairs, in the storm-lit silence, two broken souls had found each other, and the haunted house felt a little less empty. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world scrubbed and raw, puddles reflecting a pale sky outside Lena's window. Ashland's streets still glistened, the smell of wet earth drifting through the half-open panes. Lena woke with Scout pressed against her side, the dog's heavy warmth anchoring her in a world that sometimes felt too thin to bear. For the first time in months, she did not dread the day. She moved through her morning routine in silence, slipping out of her room and down to the kitchen, Scout's nails tapping softly on the linoleum behind her. Eli was already up, sipping coffee at the window, newspaper open but unread. He watched Lena and Scout, an unreadable expression on his weathered face. When Lena shrugged on her backpack and reached for Scout's leash, Eli paused. "You sure you want to take him to school, kid?" His voice was gentle, uncertain. Lena didn't speak, but her chin lifted just a notch, determination clear. Eli nodded, resigned and maybe a little relieved. "All right then. Be careful." The walk to school was quiet but tense. Lena felt eyes on her as she passed neighbors in their driveways, raking debris from the storm, the battered German shepherd limping loyally at her side. A few people waved, most stared. Lena kept her gaze straight ahead, one hand on Scout's head, the other clutching her backpack straps until her fingers ached. By the time they reached the school's cracked blacktop, children's voices had risen to a familiar morning cacophony. Laughter, shouts, the shrill of the whistle as Coach Briggs tried and failed to herd his students. Lena's steps slowed. Scout pressed closer. It was in this noisy chaos that Carter Dunn spotted her. Carter was infamous, a 13-year-old storm in his own right. Tall for his age, a shock of red hair and a mean streak that teachers whispered about but rarely confronted. He watched Lena and Scout cross the yard, something dangerous lighting in his eyes. Beside him, his usual crowd of hangers-on snickered, already sensing trouble. Lena didn't see Carter until it was too late. He blocked her path by the swings, his smile sharp, eyes flicking from her to Scout. "What's this, Whitmore? You got yourself a new mutt?" His words were poison, his tone a dare. The other kids quieted, drawn in by the promise of a scene. Scout bristled, stepping between Lena and Carter, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Carter's sneer deepened. He picked up a handful of gravel and tossed a pebble, hitting Scout on the shoulder. "Look at him. He's already broken. Just like you." Lena didn't flinch, but her face paled. Her silence, once a shield, now made her an easier target. Carter circled, never taking his eyes off Lena, looking for a crack in her armor. "Hey, Whitmore, did the fire fry your brain, or were you always such a freak?" he jeered, his voice ringing out. Several kids laughed nervously, others glanced away. No one stepped in, Scout snarled, baring his teeth. Carter pretended not to be impressed. Better put your dog down before someone else does it for you. He threw another pebble, this one harder, bouncing off Scout's snout. Lena jerked as if struck herself. She knelt beside Scout, her hands on his fur, willing him to stay calm. A teacher finally noticed, shouting for Carter to knock it off. But Carter just smirked, backing away with his crew. Whatever, mute and her mutt. He spat on the ground, then melted back into the crowd. Lena tried to steady her breathing, feeling Scout's heartbeat thunder beneath her palm. She stayed there until the bell rang, until the yard was empty, before standing and guiding Scout into the building. The rest of the day dragged. Whispers followed Lena down the hall. In science, Carter stuck out his foot to trip her. In math, he flicked a wad of paper at her head. No one said a word. Lena sat at the back, Scout waiting outside, her mind drifting to safer places. Memories of her parents, flashes of warmth and laughter. At lunch, Lena snuck outside to check on Scout. She found him behind the gym, in the shadow of the building, where the concrete stayed cool and the noise faded. Relief flooded her, until she saw the blood. Scout was lying on his side, breathing shallowly, blood oozing from a fresh gash above his eye. His fur was clumped with dirt, and he whimpered when Lena knelt beside him. For a second, the world spun. Then Lena's hands moved on their own, searching her bag for tissues, her touch frantic but gentle. She cleaned his wound with trembling fingers, tears hot on her cheeks but no sound escaping her lips. She pressed her forehead to Scout's, her body shaking with fury and fear. She knew, without needing to see, that Carter had done this. The cruelty was real, public, and growing bolder. Lena felt her helplessness pressing down, the weight of every word she couldn't say. Scout licked her hand, eyes soft even as he winced in pain. His trust was absolute. He would endure anything for her. Lena wrapped her arms around him and rocked, letting the silence stretch. Eli came for them after school, his face tight with concern. He saw the blood, the tension in Lena's jaw, but didn't ask. At home, Lena cleaned Scout's wound again, every motion measured and careful. She tucked him into a blanket beside her bed that night, her hand resting on his side long after she should have been asleep. Somewhere in the quiet, Lena's heart screamed for justice. But for now, she stayed silent, listening to the steady breathing of the only friend she had left, vowing she would never let Scout suffer alone again. The days that followed blurred together, each one heavy with a kind of quiet ache Lena was learning to carry. At home, the world outside the Whitmore house spun on. Neighbors mowed lawns, delivery trucks rumbled past. Kids' voices echoed down the street. But inside, everything felt hushed, as if the fire had burned the sound out of their lives along with the laughter. Lena retreated deeper into herself, moving through the house like a ghost, Scout never more than a few steps away. Her only comfort was the feel of his fur beneath her hand, the solid reassurance that he was still there, still breathing, still choosing her despite the hurt. Some afternoons, she'd find herself staring at the old family photos on the mantel, her parents' smiling faces, her own round cheeks before the world split apart. It felt like another lifetime, one she could barely remember. When the silence pressed too close, Lena would escape to her room with a box of crayons and a stack of blank paper. Once her drawings had been wild with color. Fields of yellow sunflowers, bright red barns, blue Oregon skies. Now she reached only for black, filling page after page with restless, jagged lines. Flames licking at windows, smoke twisting through trees, dark shadows that seemed to crawl off the paper and onto her skin. Sometimes, The only light she could manage was the shape of Scout, drawn small and fierce beside the fire. One gray afternoon, Lena sat cross-legged on her floor, her hand moving almost of its own will as she traced a black sun over a ruined house. The crayon snapped in her grip, her hand shook. She dropped it and hugged her knees to her chest, squeezing her eyes shut, trying not to feel the familiar panic rising. Scout nudged her with his nose, a soft, questioning sound. He pawed at the fallen crayon, then rested his head in her lap, brown eyes steady on hers. For a long time, Lena just breathed. She pressed her palm to his side, grounding herself in his warmth. Scout's breath was slow, deliberate, an anchor in the storm of her thoughts. Later, Eli came by with a cup of cocoa, setting it on her bedside table. He hovered in the doorway for a moment, wanting to say something but not knowing how. Lena didn't look up, but she didn't flinch away either. A small victory. Eli's eyes lingered on the stack of blackened drawings, a frown creasing his forehead. But he just nodded and left, his footsteps fading down the hall. That night, Lena let Scout sleep by her bed for the first time, not caring about rules or the hair he left behind. The room felt less empty with him there. She lay awake long after midnight, hand buried in his fur, listening to the steady sound of his breathing and the creak of the old house. Sometimes, in the deep silence, she would wake gasping from nightmares, the roar of the fire, the crackling timbers, the desperate need to call for help and the crushing horror of having no voice to do it. She'd sit bolt upright, chest heaving, and Scout would lick her face until the panic faded, his weight a comfort in the dark. School was no easier. Carter's taunts had grown quieter but sharper, delivered in whispers and sidelong glances, a constant threat that hovered over Lena like a storm cloud. Most days, Lena kept her head down, shoulders hunched, invisible as she could make herself. But she knew the cruelty was there, waiting. She could feel it in the glances, the snickers, the deliberate way the other kids avoided her in the halls. But Scout was always waiting outside, a silent sentinel. When she emerged after class, drained and brittle, he'd bound up to her, tail wagging, his presence a shield against the world. Lena would kneel, resting her forehead against his, drawing strength from the simple, uncomplicated love in his eyes. She tried sometimes to draw sunlight, big yellow circles like she used to, or blue sky, or her mother's face. But every time the colors felt wrong, the shapes came out twisted. Her hands would tremble, her breath would catch, and she'd end up turning the page, starting again in black. One afternoon, as she sat by the window, rain streaking the glass, Lena noticed Scout watching her closely. He whined, a gentle sound, then nudged her hand with his nose, insistent. She let him pull her away from the window, down the hallway, and out onto the porch where the rain had slackened to a mist. For a moment, Lena just stood there, breathing in the wet earth, Scout pressed close to her side. The world felt sharp and real. Eli watched from inside, worry etched deep into his face, but also something softer, a kind of cautious hope. He saw Lena's fingers buried in Scout's fur, the way her posture shifted when the dog was near. He understood, maybe better than anyone, the comfort of a companion who never asked for words. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and shadows lengthened across the yard, Lena picked up a yellow crayon. She hesitated, pressing it to the paper. The color bled bright and uncertain across the page, the line wobbly but there. She tried to draw a ray of sunlight reaching through the darkness, but her hand faltered, the memory too distant. She dropped the crayon, blinking back tears. Scout whined, nosing her wrist, bringing her back. It was slow, painful work, this business of healing. Lena didn't have words for it, but she felt the seed of something changing inside her, fragile as a new leaf. Scout didn't care if her drawings were dark or bright. He only cared that she was there, with him, and that somehow was enough. As the weeks passed and summer edged toward fall, a quiet transformation began in the Whitmore house. It started so small Lena almost didn't notice. A single blue streak among the black crayon shadows, a hesitant curve of sunlight sneaking across the paper. But it was there, and it grew. Lena's sketches changed in subtle ways. Where before her pages had been crowded with dark smoke and twisted branches, now patches of color began to bloom. Scout appeared in every picture, sometimes bold, standing guard against imagined threats, sometimes curled up beside Lena, a sturdy patch of brown against the chaos. She even caught herself drawing the soft outline of her mother's smile, half hidden in the corner of a page. It wasn't a sudden shift, but a series of tiny, fragile steps. Scout nudged Lena forward, always patient, always ready to meet her wherever she was. In the mornings, when the house was cold and Eli's footsteps echoed through the hall, Lena would reach for Scout's leash and slip outside before the world woke up. Their walks grew longer, down past the creek where mist hung low over the water, through meadows speckled with wildflowers, along sidewalks where neighbors swept leaves and called out greetings. She still didn't answer, but she started to lift her hand in a shy wave, sometimes managing the smallest of smiles. It was enough. Each time she did, Scout wagged his tail so hard his whole body wiggled. The town was noticing too. "There's that Whitmore girl, with the brave dog," people would whisper. Some nodded. Some offered gentle smiles. Most let her be. A few times children from school watched her, curiosity mixing with guilt, but Lena kept moving, her hand always on Scout's collar. Eli watched this growing confidence with cautious optimism. He worried over Lena constantly, but more and more he found himself stopping by her room just to see the new drawings taped to the wall, or to catch her outside, face tipped up to the sun. Sometimes he'd catch her humming softly to Scout, a tune from childhood, half forgotten, threading its way back into her heart. One golden afternoon, as the first red leaves drifted down, Lena and Scout wandered to the city park. The place was alive with families and laughter, kids chasing soccer balls, toddlers giggling on the swings. Lena paused under a maple tree. Scout pressed to her side, the sunlight warm on their faces. She felt the old fear flutter in her chest, but then Scout nudged her knee, as if reminding her she wasn't alone. Suddenly, a frantic wail cut through the playground noise, a small, lost cry, sharp and terrified. Lena turned. There, near the sandbox, a little boy, no older than 4, stood bawling, cheeks streaked with tears, hands balled into fists. His mother was nowhere in sight. Scout's ears perked. Without waiting for a command, he trotted over to the boy, barking softly, tail wagging low. The boy stumbled backward, startled, but Scout sat down and offered a gentle paw. Lena hesitated at the edge of the crowd, panic flaring. Should she go? Could she help? She watched the boy's fear soften as Scout licked his hand, then looked around desperately. Heart hammering, Lena stepped forward. People were staring, but she forced herself to kneel beside the boy, keeping her voice gentle, eyes kind. She pointed to Scout, then mimed wiping her own tears away, offering a soft, reassuring smile. The boy hiccuped, then reached for her, clutching her sleeve. A woman, his mother, frantic, came rushing across the grass. When she saw Lena and Scout comforting her son, she broke down in relief, scooping the boy into her arms. "Thank you," she gasped, tears shining in her eyes. "Thank you so much." Lena just nodded. her own smile shy but real. She stroked Scout's head, feeling her heart settle. That moment changed something inside Lena. For the first time since the fire, she'd helped someone else. She'd moved through fear and found, at the other side, a kind of strength she thought she'd lost forever. That night, she drew the scene in her journal. Scout, the little boy, a hand stretched out in comfort. This time the colors glowed. For the first time in months, a genuine, unforced smile flickered across her face. Eli saw it too. He watched from the porch as Lena and Scout returned home, Lena's head a little higher, her steps lighter. Over dinner, he found himself telling her about his own childhood dog, a scrappy mutt who'd once rescued him from a river. He talked, and Lena listened, her eyes bright, the silence between them less heavy than before. That evening, Lena took out a fresh sheet of paper. She drew blue sky, wispy clouds, sunlight streaming through leaves, and in the center, Scout, standing tall. When Eli peeked into her room and saw the new drawing taped above her bed, he felt something loosen in his own chest. For the first time since the fire, he let himself hope. The healing wasn't loud or sudden. It was a quiet, steady series of small moments. An unexpected smile, a hand on a shoulder, a dog's gentle nudge. Lena still woke some nights to nightmares. She still had days when the world felt too much. But now, each morning brought a little more light. And as the days slipped by, Lena found she wasn't just surviving. She was beginning, in her own quiet way, to come back to life. The buzz of excitement hung in the air as Ashland prepared for its annual county fair. For most, it was the highlight of the season, a chance to show off prize pies, see the new rides, and run wild with friends among the smell of popcorn and hay. For Lena, it was a test. She hadn't been around a real crowd since before the fire, but this year Eli encouraged her, gently but firmly, to go. "You should be seen," he'd said, his eyes kind but determined. "And Scout deserves to have some fun too." Saturday morning dawned bright and cool, while Lena dressed carefully, fingers fumbling with the buttons on her faded blue shirt. Scout paced the hall, picking up on her nerves, tail wagging low and hopeful. Eli drove them to the fairgrounds in his old pickup, humming under his breath to fill the silence. When they arrived, Lena hesitated, hand frozen on the door handle. Scout whined, pressing his nose into her palm. She nodded. "Let's do this." The fairgrounds were alive with noise and color. Kids raced past with cotton candy. Farmers stood by their prize-winning pumpkins. A band played off-key country tunes near the main tent. Lena walked close to Scout, every muscle taut. But after a while, she felt herself relax. For the first time in a long time, she was just another face in the crowd, almost invisible, almost safe. Eli wandered off to check out the antique tractor display, leaving Lena and Scout to roam. They watched the pie-eating contest, Scout drooling at the sweet smells. Lena tried her hand at the ring toss, missing every shot, but smiling anyway. When she found the petting zoo, a group of little kids gathered around Scout, eager to stroke his ears and marvel at his scars. Scout soaked up the attention, tail thumping. But not everyone at the fair was kind. As Lena turned away from the petting zoo, she heard the familiar icy laugh behind her. Carter Dunn stood just a few feet away, his crew clustered close, their eyes glinting with mischief. "Well, if it isn't the mute freak and her mangy mutt," Carter sneered, loud enough for several people nearby to hear. A few adults glanced over, uncertain, but no one intervened. Lena felt the old fear crawl up her spine, but Scout stepped between her and Carter, hackles raised, his growl low and steady. Carter laughed. "Ah, Is your hero gonna save you now? Bet he wouldn't last a minute in a real fight. He glanced at his friends, daring them to laugh with him. The crowd thickened. Kids from school, parents, strangers, drawn by the rising tension. Suddenly, Carter lunged forward, shoving Scout roughly with his foot. The German shepherd yelped and staggered sideways, his eyes wide with hurt and confusion. The sound echoed, sharp and ugly, across the fairground. Lena froze, panic burning through her. The humiliation was unbearable. Everyone was staring, whispering. Carter, for a split second, seemed to realize he'd gone too far, but the moment passed. "You see," he jeered, "he's nothing, just a stupid broken dog, just like you." Lena's breath came in short, shallow bursts. Scout whimpered, looking up at her as if to ask, "What did I do wrong?" Tears pricked Lena's eyes, but she forced them down, hands shaking at her sides. Carter's friends shifted uneasily, unsure now. A hush fell over the crowd. And then something inside Lena snapped. The thing she'd kept locked away since the fire, since her world had burned, and she'd lost her voice. The memory of Scout's loyalty, his pain, and his love surged through her. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, her fists clenching. She stepped forward, voice raw and trembling, but louder than it had been in months. "Don't you ever touch him again!" The words rang out, sharp and clear, slicing through the silence. Heads turned. Carter's eyes widened, stunned. The whole crowd seemed to lean in. Lena wasn't done. "You're the coward," she said, voice steadier now. "You pick on people who can't fight back, but you can't hurt us anymore." She stood tall, chin lifted, Scout at her side. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, people began to clap. A few at first, then more until it was a real, honest applause. Carter's face flushed red, his bravado crumbling as adults moved in, whispering about what they'd seen. He shoved his hands in his pockets and slunk away, his friends trailing behind, suddenly quiet. Lena knelt beside Scout, pulling him into a fierce hug. "You're okay," she whispered, her tears finally spilling. Tears of relief, of fear, of release. Scout licked her cheek, tail wagging weakly. Eli found them moments later, panic on his face. "What happened?" he asked, voice tight. Lena just shook her head, not trusting herself to speak again. But Eli saw the crowd's lingering glances, the way strangers offered soft words of support, and the way Lena held Scout like she'd never let him go. He understood. He squeezed her shoulder gently, pride and sorrow mixing in his eyes. The fair continued around them, music, laughter, rides spinning in the twilight. But for Lena and Scout, something had shifted forever. She had spoken, and people had listened. The world was still dangerous, still unfair, but Lena was no longer invisible. She had found her voice, and nothing would take it from her again. The video of Lena's confrontation at the county fair went viral before she and Scout even made it home that night. Someone in the crowd had filmed everything: the taunts, Carter's cruel kick, and most importantly, Lena's voice rising from the silence, fierce and clear. By the time Eli pulled into the driveway, his phone was already buzzing with messages from friends and neighbors. When Lena stepped inside, tired and wrung out, she didn't know she had become the center of a growing storm. Eli sat her down after dinner. He hesitated, choosing his words with care, then showed her the video. Lena watched herself on the tiny screen, heart pounding. There she was, trembling but unbroken, Scout at her side, her voice echoing through the fairground. The clip ended with her words, "Don't you ever touch him again," and the crowd's uncertain applause. Overnight, Lena's story spread far beyond Ashland. People on social media called her brave, a hero, an inspiration. Messages poured in from strangers: a teacher in Boston, a nurse in Texas, a girl from a small town in Montana who said, "I know what it's like to be silent. Thank you for speaking up." Supportive comments flooded the page, but not all were kind. Some accused Lena of being dramatic or doubted the cruelty she'd endured. Others, crueler, colder, mocked her silence, calling her names she'd heard whispered in school hallways. Scout didn't understand any of it. To him, the world was the same, a little more tense, perhaps, but full of the same smells and routines. He slept curled at Lena's feet while she scrolled through hundreds of messages, her emotions swinging from gratitude to confusion to fear. The school principal called Eli early the next morning. "You need to come in," she said, her voice grave. "There's a problem." Eli gripped the phone, his jaw set. When he told Lena, she nodded, a familiar dread returning. At school, the air was electric. Reporters lingered by the gates, cameras ready, while students clustered in anxious knots, whispering. The principal ushered Lena and Eli into her office, her face tight with concern. "You understand. This is a serious matter. The video has brought unwanted attention to the school. And now, well, Carter's father is filing a formal complaint." Lena's head snapped up in disbelief. "Against me?" Her voice was still fragile from use, but the shock was clear. The principal's answer was cautious. "Carter's family says you incited a scene. They claim you've been aggressive and disruptive." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We know you've suffered, Lena, but we have to follow procedure." Eli's temper flashed for the first time in years. "So the kid who kicked a dog and bullied my niece for months gets to play the victim now?" The principal raised her hands, pleading for calm. "It's complicated. The school board will hold a hearing. You'll have a chance to tell your side." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Lena endured stares and whispers, some students shyly offering support, others snickering or glancing away. Carter walked the halls with his head high, a smirk on his lips, his father's influence shielding him from consequences. For now. That night, Lena curled up with Scout on her bed, scrolling through the messages on her phone. Most were kind, but the cruel ones cut deep. She read and reread the supportive comments, fingers tracing the words, trying to let them in. Scout nudged her hand, sensing her anxiety. She buried her face in his fur, drawing strength from his quiet loyalty. Eli sat in his armchair, eyes fixed on a family photo, himself, his late wife, and a much younger Lena, all smiling in a world that no longer existed. He finally let the tears come, grief and frustration mingling with pride. Scout patted over and rested his head in Eli's lap. For a moment they sat together, three survivors weathering a new kind of storm. Days blurred together as the hearing approached. The media attention grew. The fairground video was replayed on local news. Internet pundits debated Lena's actions, and people from all over the country wrote letters, some supportive, others angry. Eli set up an email account just to handle the flood. He tried to shield Lena from the worst of it, but she knew. The world was watching, and she was suddenly, terrifyingly visible. Lena started writing in a notebook, pouring out the things she couldn't say aloud. She drew Scout's face on the cover, his eyes steady and brave. She wrote letters to her parents, telling them about the fire, about the silence, about Scout. She wrote about the fair, about finding her voice, and about the fear that it would all be for nothing. The night before the hearing, Lena and Eli sat in the kitchen, the air heavy with worry. Eli reached across the table, his hand trembling. "No matter what happens tomorrow, I'm proud of you," he said. "You did what was right." Lena nodded. She thought about all the people who had written to her, about the kids at school who looked at her differently now. She thought about Carter and his father, and all the people who would rather she stayed quiet. Then she looked at Scout, asleep at her feet, and knew that whatever happened next, she wasn't alone. As darkness fell, Lena took Scout for a walk. The world was quiet, the stars bright above the silent town. She paused on the bridge over the creek, Scout pressed close at her side. "We can do this," she whispered, and for the first time she believed it might be true. The day of the school board hearing arrived cloaked in gray clouds, the kind that seemed to press down on Ashland with an extra weight. Lena woke before dawn, heart pounding in her chest, hands already clammy as she reached for Scout. The German shepherd was alert, sensing her tension, and pressed his cold nose into her palm, steadying her. Eli insisted on driving. He wore his old suit, the same one from his wife's funeral, his face set with determination that was new and, for Lena, a comfort. She sat in the back seat, Scout's head in her lap, staring out the window as the town rolled by. The gas station, the shuttered movie theater, the tiny bakery that had once been her favorite spot. Everything looked smaller somehow than it had the day before the fire. Outside the school, a small crowd had gathered. Some faces were familiar, teachers, classmates, parents, but others were strangers, drawn by the story that had swept through town and beyond. Reporters clustered near the entrance, cameras flashing as Lena stepped out, flanked by Eli and Scout. For a moment, Lena froze, blinded by the noise and attention, but Scout nudged her forward. Eli's hand rested gently on her shoulder. Inside, the boardroom was packed, every seat taken. A long table dominated the center, with stern-faced school officials at one end and Carter Dunn and his father at the other. Carter avoided Lena's gaze, his hands fidgeting in his lap. His father looked angry, jaw clenched, eyes cold. The chairwoman called the meeting to order. "We are here to discuss a serious incident that occurred at the county fair, involving two of our students, Lena Whitmore and Carter Dunn." Her voice was crisp, no nonsense, but Lena could hear the tension under the surface. She glanced at Eli, who nodded encouragingly. Carter's father spoke first, his words slick and practiced. "My son has become the victim in this situation. This media circus has put him in danger. He's received threats. We believe Lena's actions, her aggressive outburst, her refusal to move on, escalated things beyond what was necessary." Carter kept his eyes down, jaw working as his father spoke for him. The board murmured, scribbling notes. Then it was Lena's turn. Eli squeezed her hand. Lena rose, her knees shaking, Scout pressing close at her side. Every eye in the room was on her. Her hands trembled, but she took a breath and found her voice, still raw but steady. "I didn't want a scene," she began, voice wavering at first. "I just wanted to protect my dog. Carter hurt Scout. He's hurt me before, too. I haven't spoken for a long time, but that day I had to." She swallowed, meeting the chairwoman's gaze. "Sometimes being silent makes things worse." She looked around the room, at the students she knew, at the teachers who had watched her fade these past months, at Carter, whose eyes flickered with something like shame. "Scout saved me after the fire. I wouldn't have survived without him. I couldn't let him get hurt for being loyal." Scout rested his head on Lena's knee, anchoring her. Tears welled in the corners of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. One by one, people began to speak. A teacher described Carter's history of cruelty, voice trembling with long-held frustration. A student, one of Carter's former friends, stood and admitted to helping him bully Lena, face red with guilt. Another parent recounted what they'd seen at the fair, insisting that Lena had shown courage, not aggression. Carter shifted, uncomfortable under the weight of so many eyes. The chairwoman called on him to speak. He hesitated, then stood, voice shaking. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was angry. But I shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have kicked Scout. I'm sorry. He looked at Lena, eyes wet, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. The room was silent for a long moment. After deliberation, the board delivered its decision. Carter would face counseling and mandatory community service for his actions. Lena would not be punished. The board expressed regret that she had been made to feel unsafe at school and vowed to address bullying more seriously in the future. Lena felt a wash of relief, but it was bittersweet. She had stood up, and people had listened, but the scars of cruelty didn't vanish with a verdict. The next morning, Lena returned to school with Scout by her side. Most students looked at her with new respect. Some offered shy smiles or quiet nods. But not everyone welcomed the change. Spray paint scrawled across her locker in ugly red letters. Mute freak. Lena's heart twisted, but she refused to look away. She reached for her notebook, pulled out a marker, and drew a small yellow sun over the word mute. Scout wagged his tail, pressing his head against her leg. Eli met her at the gate that afternoon, pride and worry mingling in his tired smile. That night, Lena sat on her porch, Scout at her feet, Eli reading the newspaper nearby. For the first time in a long while, she let herself dream that maybe, just maybe, things would keep getting better. Inside, her drawings were changing. More blue sky, more sunlight. Scout standing tall beside her in every frame. She was no longer alone. The fight wasn't over, but she knew she had a voice. And now the world had heard it. Late August brought an uneasy heat to Ashland. The grass along the trails had grown brittle, leaves curling at the edges, and the hills around the town were dusted with gold and shadow. Lena woke that morning to the promise of another cloudless day, and Eli, always watchful but now more trusting, suggested a hike in the woods behind their house. Fresh air'll do us all good, he said, pouring Scout a bowl of water. Scout's tail thumped approval. By midday, Lena and Scout had set off, backpacks slung and spirits higher than they'd been in weeks. The woods were alive with summer sounds, crickets chattering, the occasional whir of a distant chainsaw. Lena felt Scout's energy, his alertness to every rustle and breeze, and let herself move deeper down the winding path, enjoying the hush that seemed to settle over them. For the first time in what felt like forever, she forgot to be afraid. As they climbed a narrow ridge, Lena paused to rest in a patch of shade. Scout circled her, sniffing the air, then lay down, tongue lolling. Lena sketched in her notebook. Sunlight dappled on the page. The world felt safe, ordinary, but behind them, miles away, something was shifting. It started as a distant, almost dreamlike haze, smoke curling up above the trees. Lena didn't notice at first, but Scout did. He jerked upright, nose twitching, his body tense and alert. When Lena followed his gaze, she saw it. A plume of gray climbing the horizon, faint but growing. Her stomach clenched. She listened. Was that thunder or something else? In the uneasy silence, Lena remembered the night of the fire, the way the world could change in a breath. Scout barked once, sharp and urgent, and Lena bolted upright, heart racing. They'd wandered further than she thought. She packed her things, nerves prickling, and hurried back along the trail. Scout pressed to her side. The smoke thickened, the sky turning the sickly yellow of an old bruise. She moved faster, breath tight in her chest. Suddenly, the wind shifted. The scent of burning pine hit like a slap. Somewhere close, a branch cracked. the air filling with the roar of distant flames. Lena stumbled, panic crawling up her throat. She tried to keep her mind clear. Just get home, just get home. But the world felt wrong, angles sharp, colors off. They reached a fork in the path, left or right. Lena hesitated, then took the right, trusting her gut. Scout darted ahead, leading, ears flat and eyes wide. The woods darkened as smoke closed in, ash floating down like strange gray snow. Lena coughed, eyes stinging, legs trembling as she ran. She heard the first roar of the fire cresting the hill behind them. Then her foot caught a root. She pitched forward, pain lancing through her ankle. She cried out, a hoarse, wordless sound, and collapsed in the dirt. Her ankle throbbed, twisted or worse. She tried to stand, but the pain brought her back down. Scout circled, barking frantically, pawing at her shoulder. Lena gritted her teeth, biting back tears. The smoke was thicker now, flames licking through the trees, crackling ever closer. Scout whined, eyes wide with terror, but he didn't run. He stood beside her, barking as loud as he could, a living beacon in the chaos. Far away, Eli heard the distant sirens and the first news on the radio. "Wildfire in the hills, evacuate immediately," the voice warned. Panic hammered his heart. He grabbed his coat and keys, running into the street, ignoring the smoke stinging his eyes. "Lena!" he shouted, again and again, as he plunged into the woods. Back on the ridge, Lena's world shrank to the circle of light around her, the fire's roar growing. She squeezed Scout's fur, voice cracking. "Stay, please stay." It was all she could manage, the words a prayer and a plea. Scout pressed closer, never looking away. He barked over and over until his voice was ragged. Branches fell, the heat nearly unbearable. Just as Lena's hope began to fade, she heard another voice. Eli's, desperate, calling her name. She tried to shout, but all she could do was cough, tears streaking her soot-blackened cheeks. Scout surged forward, barking louder, guiding Eli through the smoke. Eli burst through the brush, eyes wild, and swept Lena into his arms, Scout limping beside him. He half carried, half dragged them down the slope, through choking smoke and falling ash, all the way to the fire road where the rescue crews waited. The moment they reached safety, Lena collapsed against Eli, sobbing with relief. Scout fell to the ground, chest heaving, exhausted but alive. The firefighters checked Lena's ankle, a bad sprain, nothing broken. Scout was singed and limping, but otherwise unharmed. Eli wrapped them both in his arms, trembling. For a long moment, none of them spoke, overwhelmed by the nearness of loss and the miracle of survival. Later that night, Lena sat on the porch, Scout's head in her lap, Eli nearby. She looked up at the stars, clear again, impossibly bright, and felt the weight of everything that had happened. "You stayed," she whispered to Scout, voice hoarse but full of awe. He licked her hand, his loyalty absolute. In that moment, Lena understood the true depth of love and courage. It wasn't grand gestures or loud proclamations. It was the willingness to stay, to fight for someone else, even when the world seemed lost to flame. She knew now. Scout would die before he left her, and she would do the same for him. The days after the fire unfolded slowly, each one softer than the last, as if the world itself was letting out a long-held breath. Lena recovered at home, her sprained ankle wrapped and propped on a pillow, Scout never leaving her side. The town buzzed with stories of the rescue, a girl, her dog, and an old man emerging from the woods with ash in their hair and a stubborn spark in their eyes. Ashland, for all its smallness, came alive with support. Strangers dropped off casseroles and cards. Kids from school sent drawings of Scout, most of them triumphant, tails wagging, eyes bright. Eli set up a spot in the living room for Lena, where sunlight streamed through the windows. It became their command center, a fortress of books, recovery snacks, and letters from people who'd heard Lena's story online. Lena read the letters aloud to Scout. Some came from distant states, written in messy crayon or neat cursive, all filled with gratitude and hope. "Dear Lena," one little girl wrote from Idaho, "I saw you and your dog on TV. I was scared after my grandpa died. But now I know it's okay to feel sad. Thank you." Another letter read, "You made me believe people can be brave even when they're scared." Lena's voice grew steadier with each letter, tears and laughter mingling in the afternoons, as Scout listened with his head in her lap. For the first time, Lena realized that she wasn't just surviving. She was helping others find hope too. Eli, watching this transformation, felt something shift inside himself. He'd been a man of few words since his wife's passing, grief calcifying around his heart. But now, as he listened to Lena's halting laughter and saw the way Scout curled around her, the ice began to melt. One evening, as twilight crept through the house, Eli reached out and took Lena's hand. They sat in comfortable silence, both healing in ways they never expected. Lena found herself wanting to do more. With Eli's help, she started a small blog called Scout's Voice, a safe space for anyone struggling with trauma or silence. She shared her drawings, color returning, Scout always beside her, and wrote about her journey. At first, the words came hard, but she kept at it, writing about pain and progress, about nightmares and the slow return of hope. The blog grew quietly at first, then faster as people from all over found their way to Lena's story. Parents messaged her for advice on helping quiet children. Other kids posted their own art or stories. Sometimes Lena would answer them herself. Sometimes Eli would help her find the right words. Most often, it was enough just to know they weren't alone. Scout's role grew too. The town invited Lena and her dog to a special ceremony at the park, an event that drew more people than anyone could remember. There were speeches and applause, but what mattered most to Lena was the children who crowded around Scout, hugging him, whispering secrets into his ear. He wore a blue ribbon around his neck, and Lena could swear he stood taller for the rest of the day. The town honored Scout and Lena for their bravery, calling them symbols of resilience and hope. Local news ran a story, and a children's book publisher reached out, inviting Lena to contribute a chapter to a book about real-life courage. The offer terrified her at first, her story on a page, read by strangers. But Eli and Scout cheered her on, and eventually she agreed. Through these changes, Lena thought often about what healing really meant. She realized it wasn't a single moment, but 1,000 little steps, setbacks and small victories, days when she still woke gasping from dreams of fire, and days when sunlight filled the room and she felt almost whole. In her writing and drawings, Lena explored everything she'd learned. She drew herself and Scout standing in the rain, facing down the fire, walking through a crowd at the fair. She drew the shadows that sometimes still crept in, but always with Scout at her side, a promise that she would never face darkness alone. Sometimes, the pain still felt raw. The scars, inside and out, didn't vanish overnight. Lena knew that some people still whispered when she passed by, that not everyone who'd hurt her was truly sorry. But the difference now was that she wasn't alone with it. She had Scout, she had Eli, and she had a community that had learned to listen. One afternoon, Lena sat on the porch with her sketchbook and wrote a message to herself on the inside cover. Healing isn't perfect, but hope is stubborn and love never quits. She drew a sun rising over the old Whitmore house, Scout sitting beside her, Eli waving from the porch. The world felt bigger, the colors brighter. The blog became a lifeline for others. Letters arrived from parents, teachers, kids who struggled in silence, each one a reminder that Lena's courage had started something real. She replied to as many as she could, always ending with a simple message: "You're not alone." Eli, once emotionally distant, was now the one who encouraged Lena to reach out, to keep sharing her story. One day he brought her a cake baked from her mother's old recipe. They sat together at the kitchen table, Scout snoozing underfoot, the warmth of family surrounding them. As summer faded into fall, Lena felt herself changing. She was still the girl who survived a fire, who once hid from the world. But she was also a friend, a helper, a voice for others. She looked at Scout, at Eli, and at the town that had learned to see her not as a victim, but as a leader. Ashland's scars remained, its gossip, its silence, its lingering pain, but so did its hope. And at the center of it all, Lena and Scout stood together, not just surviving, but shining for others who needed a little light in the darkness. The day of the children's book launch dawned bright and crisp, the kind of autumn morning that made every color in Ashland seem sharper and every shadow softer. Lena dressed carefully, her hands only shaking a little as she buttoned her favorite sweater. Scout circled anxiously at her feet, picking up on her nerves, but there was a spark in his eyes, like he knew something important was about to happen. Eli drove them to the Ashland Public Library, now decorated with balloons, handmade banners, and tables stacked high with brand new books. Lena's story was in one of them, right between chapters about a girl who'd rescued her brother from a flood and a boy who'd built prosthetic legs for stray dogs. But it was Lena's chapter, her voice, that the organizers asked her to read aloud. Inside, the main room was full. Children and parents sat cross-legged on the carpet. Teachers lined the walls, and a few news crews hovered at the back, their cameras whirring softly. Lena spotted some of her classmates, kids who once whispered about her or turned away in the halls. Now they were watching with curiosity, even respect. Carter sat in the third row, quiet, his hands folded in his lap. He gave Lena a hesitant nod, a silent apology she accepted with a small, grateful smile. Eli squeezed her shoulder, then sat with Scout at his feet in the front row. Lena took a deep breath, stepped up to the microphone, and opened her copy of the book. The room went silent, so quiet that she could hear the hum of the lights, the soft shuffling of little feet, Scout's steady breathing. She began to read. Her voice was clear and steady, shaped by months of pain and healing, by long silences and brave, trembling words. She spoke of the fire, of losing her family and her voice, of finding Scout in the storm, of all the nights she thought she'd never feel hope again. She told them about the cruelty she'd faced, the friends she'd found, the moment she finally spoke up for Scout and for herself. She described the fear that came with standing out, the weight of people's stares, the sting of hateful words. But then she spoke of what came after, the messages from strangers, the kindness of neighbors, the healing that grew in small, stubborn ways. She told them how Scout never left her side, how Eli learned to listen, and how she learned that the voice inside her was worth sharing, even if it shook sometimes. As Lena finished reading, the room remained silent for a heartbeat longer, a hush filled with awe, understanding, and something almost holy. Then the applause began, soft at first, then building until the room was filled with it. Lena looked up, tears in her eyes, and saw Eli beaming, Scout wagging his tail so hard his whole body wiggled. After the reading, people lined up to shake her hand, to hug Scout, to share their own stories of hardship and healing. A little girl whispered, "I'm scared sometimes too," and Lena knelt to hug her, whispering back, "It's okay. You're brave for telling me." Carter waited until the end of the line, and when his turn came, he said, "I'm sorry for everything. I want to be better." Lena nodded. "You can," she answered, offering her hand. Carter took it, his grip firm. That afternoon, the library held a workshop for children who had struggled with trauma, silence, or fear. Lena and Scout led the group, Scout listening quietly as children read poems, showed their drawings, or simply sat close to someone who understood. Eli watched from the doorway, heart full, finally able to let go of the sorrow that had weighed him down since losing his wife. As the day wound down, Lena stepped outside into the golden light, Scout at her side, Eli trailing behind. The world seemed bigger now, brighter, full of possibilities that had once felt far away. She looked at her uncle, her chosen family, and at the dog who had saved her life in 1,000 small ways. "We saved each other, didn't we?" Lena whispered, her voice clear, trembling with joy and pride. Eli smiled, voice rough. "Yeah, kid, I think you saved us all." Scout barked, tail thumping, a soft blessing, a celebration of everything they'd survived. In the weeks that followed, Lena's blog continued to grow. Her story inspired a campaign in Ashland for better mental health support in schools, and a new program matched therapy dogs with kids who needed them most. She was invited to speak at other schools, to read at libraries, to share her art and her journey. With every new story she heard, Lena understood something deeper. That courage was not just about speaking out, but about standing with others, listening, and never letting go of hope. She reflected often on the lessons she'd learned. That trauma isolates, but connection heals. That the scars we carry can teach us empathy if we let them. That steadfast loyalty, whether from a person or a dog, can change not just one life, but many. Pain and loss would always be part of her, but so would resilience, kindness, and the fierce belief that small acts of love could transform the world. Lena found herself at the center of a new family, a family of survivors, listeners, and dreamers. Scout, ever loyal, was at the heart of it all, a reminder that even the most wounded soul could become a source of strength for others. And as she looked out over Ashland, Lena knew that her voice, once lost to fire and fear, had become a beacon. Not just for herself, but for anyone who struggled in silence, anyone searching for hope. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a leader, an advocate, and a friend. The story ended not with a final word, but with Lena's voice ringing out, a promise, an invitation, and a call to action. If you're lost, if you're afraid, you're not alone. Speak up, reach out, there's always hope. Eli squeezed her hand, and Scout barked again, the last word belonging to the friend who started it all.